But welcome. It's so nice to have you all here. Thank you for showing up to the second workshop in the MAA-GSE's podcast workshopping series. So our last episode, again, I had mentioned you'll be able to access it for our last workshop. It was recorded and posted to the MAA's YouTube page. And I have a bunch of links up here that if you check out the chat, you'll see them right now. So hello, welcome everyone. It's so nice to have you here. I'm going to get us started by introducing the chair of our GSC, John Correa, who's here with us today. He's going to talk for a little bit, and then we'll jump into the actual workshop itself. So before anything else, John, thanks so much for joining us. Do you want to take it away?
Thank you, Logan. I won't steal a lot of Hayley's spotlight. So yeah, and I'm a poor substitute here. So yeah, let me just be real quick. I just wanted to talk to everybody about the Graduate Student Committee of the Medieval Academy of America and the kind of work that we do. So we're the main group within the MAA organization to kind of like create events and networking opportunities for our global community of medievalist graduate students. Okay, we do this through the organization of conference sessions at major medievalist conferences such as ICMS Kalamazoo, IMC Leeds, and the annual meeting of the Medieval Academy. We also have our quarterly newsletter, which just went out last week. Thanks, Logan, for leading that charge. And yeah, and we're very active on social media, on Facebook and Twitter. So if you have anything going on that would be of interest to graduate students, or you need help with like spreading the word on something, like, we're very happy to help you. Just feel free to reach out to us. You can find all our contact information on the MAA-GSC webpage, which Logan has among his collection of links that he's distributing repeatedly. And lastly, it's exciting to say that we're finally once again in self-nomination season. So yeah, the GSC is comprised of 6 members that serve for 2 years. And yes, as we are finishing this cycle, 3 of us will be stepping down of the committee and 3 vacancies will be open. So Logan is linking there the website for the application. If you would like to self-nominate, the instructions and the deadline is January 15, and all instructions are there, and it should be pretty straightforward. Okay, but if you have any questions, again, feel free to reach out to me. And I will gladly be able to talk to you about the kind of work the GSC does and what it entails to be a member. What are the responsibilities? Okay, well, thank you very much. And yeah, I'm returning the mic to Logan.
Thanks so much, John. So that's a great thing to point out. And I'll talk through it one more time before I bring us over to start talking about our actual workshop. So just for those of you who have been popping in, check out the list of links that I'm throwing in the chat. I'll update it periodically. So again, don't feel like you need to go looking for them. They will come to you, but I'll run through them very quickly. We have podcasting resources, which we really recommend you check out. A lot of the things Hayley mentions today will be linked in that document. So that'll make things a little easier for you if you go searching. We have the link to the MAA-GSC's webpage and a link as well to the self-nomination form to join. Highly recommend. It's been a really wonderful 2 years for me, and I'll be sad to be leaving. So, you know, got to plug that. Again, our webinars are available here. And then you also have links to Hayley's professional website with her contact information, as well as a link to the specific podcast episode that she'll be mentioning throughout today's workshop. So again, I'll drop those in there, but check those out when you get the chance. And thank you all again for showing up to this. We really do appreciate it. And thank you especially to Hayley, who's here with us, helping us out with this workshop today. So as I've mentioned, and as I've already introduced her, Hayley R. Bowman is a PhD candidate at the Department of History at the University of Michigan. She's also the liaison for the Eisenberg Institute of Historical Studies, and she's a host and season producer of the University of Michigan's podcast Reverb Effect. And that is the one that's linked to in our chat over here. So broadly, she researches women, religion, and place and space in the early modern Spanish world, and her research considers questions of gender, materiality, iconography, and theology in the pre-modern Atlantic. Today's workshop is going to focus on post-production, so that's going to be really everything that happens after you hit end record and onward. And Hayley will really take us through that. So, you know, with no further ado, I'm going to pass it off to her. Thank you so much for joining us, Hayley, and I'm looking forward to a great workshop. Oh, and I should say, just before I forget and really hand it over, we're going to be using the Q&A feature. So as questions come up, you feel free, you can drop them in the chat, but we'd really recommend using the Q&A feature. You'll see the button down there. As you log them, we'll hold them and collect them. If they're really pressing and they can be answered through chat, I will do my best to answer them in like as they roll in, but otherwise we'll hold on to them, and at the end we'll have some time set aside for questions. So, get your brains working, and see you at the end. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for that, Logan and Jonathan, and thank you to the Medieval Academy of America for this opportunity to talk about podcasting today. So I'm going to start my presentation. Okay, can everyone see that? Just want to check. Okay, cool. Okay, so as Logan mentioned, I am a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan, and I have produced a season of Reverb Effect, which is our Department of History podcast. So today I'm going to talk about what we've defined as post-production. But first I wanted to give a little bit of a recap for those of you who maybe couldn't make it last time, kind of where we've been, so that we can see where we're going. So last time, and again, this recording of last workshop is available on the Medieval Academy's YouTube and on the website. We discussed how to start a historical podcast, which included things like organization, timing, and the progression of ideas through a podcast narrative, how to use historical narrative, understanding an audience for a podcast. And we finished up by talking about tips for recording at home. So this is for most of us who don't have access to a professional studio. I talked a lot about how to record something in the privacy of your own home and get the highest quality recording. And then also understanding podcasting as a performance, which goes into that recording, right? You need to perform as you record. And so today we're kind of picking up where we left off. So the idea behind this would be, this is kind of the stage after you've recorded something, you have your recording on your computer, and now you need to turn your recording and maybe some other recordings you made, maybe an interview or something like that. You need to turn this into a podcast episode. And how do we do that? So basically, when is an episode finished and how do we get there? Is the theme of the day today. When I sat down to think about the post-production process, I broke it down into 4 different steps. And I think breaking this down into steps makes it really understandable, because I do want to stress that this is sort of a bit tech heavy, especially when we talk about sound editing and sound mixing. But I want to stress that before I started work on Reverb Effect, I had 0 experience with sound editing and sound mixing. I didn't know how to do any of this, and I'm giving you my best tips and information based on my own personal experience and being self-taught in this. And I want to help you and kind of really emphasize that anyone can do this. It just takes a little bit of time, and it is intuitive and kind of easy to pick up. Even for someone, I would define myself as not someone who's particularly tech savvy, and I was able to do this, and I actually find it really rewarding and fun. So I don't want anyone to be intimidated, and I'm hoping that this will help you feel like this is really achievable and it's something that can be done. And I believe even students can do it. I am very much into exploring podcasting in the classroom. So undergrads can do this, you can do this, anyone can do this, in my opinion. So let's start with sound editing. That's the first step. So again, this is the idea that you have a file, a recording file on your computer, and you need to start editing it and cleaning it up and making it sound good for a podcast. Again, general cleaning up of your recordings. So I've broken this into 2 stages. I think there's a general sound balance and removal stage, and then there's a more fine-tuned removal stage that will happen later. And I recommend in between the stages is where you need to be making the major, what I would call cuts to the audio. So for example, let's say you recorded something, and during the recording, you decided you needed to take a drink of water or something, or there was a pause, or you started saying something and maybe you said something incorrectly, or you wanted to try it again. And so you started over and you said that sentence or that paragraph again. That's what I'm calling cutting, when you're removing that stuff. This is everything that that's not going to appear in the episode. But the first thing you need to do is sound balance. Then you need to cut. and then you need to fine tune. And the fine tuned removal, in my definition, would be things like removing like breaths, things that are happening in the middle of sentences that you need to kind of tweak or change, even an or two. Those kinds of things will be happening in the fine-tuned removal stage. It doesn't help to really worry about all of those things if you're going to be cutting big parts out anyway. So that's kind of the general way that this will look as you're sound editing. And I'm going to kind of go into how you do all these things, but that's the big roadmap. When you're editing, I think that there are three major objectives or things that you're going to be looking for and things you want to be doing while you're doing this kind of phase. These are all geared toward making the podcast sound most pleasing to the audience. This is something you want someone to be ready to listen to for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, however long your episode is going to be. You want it to be a pleasant experience for the listener, right? You don't want them to be kind of bombarded with something really loud and then have something really soft, these kinds of things. You want it to be enjoyable, right? And entertaining. So first step to this is removing background noise and extra sounds. This will happen no matter your recording environment. I mean, it's of course easiest to do that when you're in a professional studio where you get the highest quality recording and the least amount of background noises, but there's always something going on there. So we need to kind of remove that. Second part is balancing audio levels. This is just making sure all the audio sounds kind of consistent and you're not, again, having something really loud or something kind of not sounding in balance with the rest of the recording. And then the third step is really experimental. So a lot of this third step depends on your voice and your recording, and it's really specific and you'll have to just kind of play around with it. You can find really some good recommendations online and I'm going to just touch on them, but this includes equalization, compression, de-essing, removing plosives and deverbing. And I'm going to talk about what all of those mean. It's a lot of terminology and I'm here to kind of help explain it on a basic level. Before I get into all of that, I do want to make a note that I think that most of the time, less is more when it comes to this. Basically, what this means is I think it's better to have a podcast that sounds more natural than a podcast that sounds overproduced. It can be really obvious when something is overproduced, when there's just a total absence of background noise. It sounds very strange when someone's talking because there is background noise behind the person talking. It can be really jarring. It can make things seem really choppy, and you want to avoid that. So a light touch is always best. And I'm just going to talk about some ways that you can do that and some things to play around with. Of course, your ears will be your best guide, and also having friends listen to it will help you. And I'll talk a little bit more about that too, but just don't go too overboard on it because no one wants something that's that overproduced. And also, I think that the time investment is not worth the payoff after a certain amount of time that you've spent doing it. Okay, so this is the definitions that I promised. I know this is a lot of text. I just kind of wanted them to be there. You can always, for the recording, you could pause, or this could give you just something to check out, just so you know what it means when you're trying to go in there and start editing things. So equalization, adjust the balance of the frequencies of the recording to help it sound more natural and pleasing to the ear. A compressor is similar to this, but it reduces the dynamic range of the recording, which basically means it's going to help things stay within a certain range so that you're not kind of all over the place in terms of the frequencies. It just makes it sound more consistent and balanced. Both of these, equalization and compression, if you do too much of it, it will make the recording sound like a robot is talking. So that's where you just want to be aware. So obviously, if you're making everything really consistent, they sound really similar, it does kind of get that robotic quality. You need to take kind of a light approach to this, but it can help adjust things that naturally happen when we talk and naturally happen in recording. Deverbing removes reverb, which is basically the result of sounds bouncing off of hard surfaces. This is why when I talked about recording last time, I talked about recording with soft surroundings. That reduces reverb. Usually you can fix that in the recording stage. But if you do have some reverb still happening, we can't always control our environment as much as we want to. You can remove some of that with deverbing. And then removing plosives and de-essing, it's very similar to deverbing. Ideally, this would be happening in the recording phase with a pop filter. Pop filter will dramatically improve any issues with plosives and de-essing, or in the S sounds and hiss. However, there are sometimes that using a filter at this stage will help. For example, I have a lisp. I personally did not DS my recordings because I think it's okay to have a lisp. It's how I sound. I thought it sounded okay. But if there are moments where things get kind of hissy and it becomes unpleasant to listen to, that's where you could, for a small section, add a de-esser, and that would help for the ear. So it's not like an aggressive hiss for the listener. And that's kind of the way you can fine tune those kinds of things. But again, I would recommend, embrace your own voice, and it's okay if there are some of these things happening. We're all humans, and that's absolutely fine. This is a big recommendation because I think it's really important. When you're working with files, I recommend working with the .wav files. This is better than MP3, which would be probably your other option that would be suggested from your recording software. This has the highest quality recording, and you want to be working with that when you're using things like Audition or GarageBand or those kinds of things. Eventually, it will probably become an MP3. That's usually how you can upload, and we'll talk about that. But when you're getting your recordings, I recommend as much as you can work with the WAV files. It makes a huge difference when you're recording. It's noticeable. If you can't, MP3 is fine. But if you have the option, choose WAV files to work with. Okay, so I'm going to show an example using Adobe Audition. I realize that Adobe Audition is not available to everyone for free. It's just the program that I used because I do get access through the university. Lots of universities offer access. There will be similar abilities in something like GarageBand that's free for Mac users. And in the document that Logan has linked, there's some other programs you can use with multi-track editing programs, and they should have similar abilities. So I just thought it would be helpful to show in Adobe Audition what I'm doing, and you should be able to achieve similar effects with any kind of software. So let me just switch to Audition. Quick here. Okay, so this is what Adobe Audition looks like. And this is an actual episode of Reverb Effect that I produced that I've tweaked a little bit to kind of show you some things today. And since this is our sound editing portion, I'm going to show you how to edit a sound recording. So this is a recording that's me talking. We're not going to listen to it because I didn't want to kind of distract you all with lots of different audio from different sources. However, I wanted to show you what it looks like. So I'm going to zoom out here. This is basically what the entire episode mix looks like. And I'm going to talk about mixing later. You can see I have 4 tracks, one being the host, one being an interview track, one being sound effects, and one being the music bed. And you can kind of see different clips that I've popped in here of people talking with music underneath it, for example. Here's, interview with some music underneath it. Sound effects are happening here, and so forth. But here at the end, all of this has already been sound edited. So I uploaded a new recording so that we could kind of look at it and I can show you. So this is my recording that I did a few days ago. Up here in the corner, so this is the multi-track view. I'm going to go to waveform to show you what it looks like. This is really cool because it gives you a visual of what it looks like, what the sound looks like. So if I zoom in here, you can see these are moments where I'm talking, and these are moments where I'm not talking. If you notice, all of this is background noise. I kind of call this like sound dust, you might want to call it, or something like that. That is probably just a low hum from the background. Here, maybe I bumped something really quickly, or there was just some kind of noise. Our first objective is to reduce the background noise. So there are several ways to do that. I know you can't see my toolbar, but I'm just hitting effects, and then you'll be able to see the drop down. It's just because of the way Zoom works. So in this effects drop down, you can see there's all kinds of different things we can do here. You may recognize some of this, like equalization, modulation, reverb. This is where you could get rid of some reverb, all of these things. I'm going to go to noise reduction. There's a couple here. You can see that there's the hiss reduction, click and pop eliminator, a de-hum or de-reverb. There's a couple of different ways that you can reduce the noise. I'm just going to do a quick denoise. Again, these are things that you can kind of play around with. I'm just going to do the default and see what happens here, and you'll see that it will hopefully reduce. Okay, so as you notice, I know it's subtle, but there's less of that sound dust happening here. It's removing it throughout the entire piece of the recording. So again, in these moments where this is a pause in between things I was saying, you can see that that's going to be less. It would be noticeable when you're listening to it, there would be less noise in the background. It's not perfect. So what I'm going to do is do a specific noise reduction. In Adobe, you can do this with this noise reduction process. So what this is doing is you have to capture a noise print of the noise you want to reduce, and it will reduce that noise throughout. So I'm going to take, I know this seems small, but there is a little bit left here. I'm going to select this, capture the noise print, and then make sure I select the entire file. And then I'm going to, let's see, I need to reduce. Okay, then I'm going to apply it. This removed it a lot more. So you can see it's basically not there anymore. That should sound a lot better. You have to listen every time because again, sometimes it can sound over-processed and then you could just, undo it. But that kind of gets rid of that background noise. That's the first step. Other things you would be doing at this point is more fine-tuned, if you want to do some more fine-tuned sound editing. This would be things like removing breathing. So as I have a lot of experience doing this, so I recognize what breaths look like. I'm going to show you. So this is me talking. Here I'm taking a breath. I know what that looks like because I've edited a lot of my own talking. One way you can reduce a breath is you can just select it like this in Adobe, and this is the volume, and you can just reduce it. That will remove it, and it won't be audible. I don't think you need to do this again too much, but occasionally it doesn't sound very good when someone's talking and then there's this big, as you're breathing into the mic. This will help you get rid of that. And I recommend doing those individually. I've not found a good way to automate it and get it. Here's like another one, for example. So those are just some things, and you can kind of see, this is also where you can look for things that might be too loud or pops. I recommend looking at this. So for example, you can see most of my talking is kind of happening on these levels. These are louder. This might be, I'm being more excited. I'm talking a little more loudly. You would have to listen to see if it's too much, but again, you can easily kind of just reduce that a little bit and make it balance out. A lot of times in interviews, laughing is really, really loud. People laugh loudly. That's what laughing is. But on a recording, it can really blow it out, and you maybe want to reduce that before you equalize, because otherwise it will really affect your equalization because it's so loud, and trying to compress that will do a lot to change everything else that sounds normal. So kind of just getting things, tweaking it, and getting it there. So that's basically what it looks like in the waveform, and that's where you can do a lot of your sound editing. Okay, so I'm going to come back to Adobe a little bit later on, but that's just some of the basics of how to do this. Let's see. Okay, so that was sound editing. Now we're on to step number 2, which is sound mixing, which is similar to sound editing, but different. So what I call mixing is what I would consider the more artistic part of the process. This is where you get to kind of showcase your personality and the way that you want this episode to sound and how you want the episode, that's kind of tone you want to set with the episode. Excuse me. I think the way to do this most effectively is to obtain a script or transcript of the existing audio. I think that should be step number 1. So if you're doing a scripted podcast, you will already have the script. If you're doing something that's not scripted, I recommend getting a transcript. Here I've posted a link to a transcription service that gives free minutes of transcription when you sign up. I did 6 episodes that I had transcribed using this website, and I didn't run out of my free minutes. So, I mean, that's quite a bit of content. I think for, doing a couple of episodes, this would work. I recommend the transcript because I think it's really important to have a plan for how you're going to be adding in music, pauses, and sound effects, which goes into the mixing process. So of course, you could do this just as you go. Maybe that's more your artistic style. I'm someone who would rather kind of look at the whole of the episode and decide where might be a good moment to bring in music. Where do I want to transition a tone? What kind of tone do I want to set and make a note of it? Where might I add in an interesting sound effect? Make a note of it. Then you have a plan to go by, and it's much more easy to follow a plan than once you get into, as you saw, the multi-track mix down. It can be a lot to deal with, and it can be hard to tell where you are in the episode. So having a transcript gives you a roadmap that you can work off of. I also then recommend gathering the music and sound effects you want to use. You can always change them if they're not working, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. But getting everything together before you embark on the mixing process makes the job so much easier, because you're not stopping and going, oh, now I need the sound of a quill on paper. Let me go find that. Then you find it, then you download it, then you put it back and you're like, where was I supposed to put that? You know, it's better if you say, oh, I have that, here it is. I'll grab it and throw it in and I'll see how it sounds. So getting everything together first is my best recommendation for sound mixing. You might be asking, where do I find free use audio? So for a podcast, the audio that you use has to be royalty free under the Creative Commons license. So you can't just use any song that you want. You have to make sure that it's something that you're not, infringing on someone's copyright. I recommend archive.org and YouTube Audio Library. This is a screenshot from YouTube Audio Library. You do have to filter by free use, which you can do. And there's so many options. This is just like literally the first things that popped up when I pulled it up the other day. I wanted to highlight something I love about YouTube Audio Library is the mood designation. So you can filter by genre, you can filter by mood. I found mood to be so helpful because oftentimes I had an idea of a tone I wanted to set. And I could just look, inspirational or moody or dramatic. Dramatic was one I used a lot. And it kind of evokes kind of the feeling that you want. Happy or inspirational might be good for a turning point in an episode. If there's something kind of happening. Cinematic was a really good one also for telling stories. Those kinds of moods were really, really helpful for the creative process and kind of can give you a little bit of guidelines, and that there's so many things that you could choose from. You can kind of narrow it down a little bit. And it's a little bit fun. Definitely set aside time to listen to things. You can star them and then you can kind of come back to them and decide what you like. But YouTube Audio Library was really cool with that. It also includes sound effects, as you can see at the top there. And you can just search for things, sound effects that you need for the episode. In my episode, for example, the Vision of Purgatory, I needed the sound of like a fire. There were like several to choose from. I could pick, one that I thought evoked the right kind of sound and mood. And I've never had it, fail me in terms of finding a kind of sound effect that I wanted. So there's lots of options. It kind of lets you be creative. Okay. So as you're choosing these things, and I've kind of talked a little bit about this, but I think it's helpful to ask yourself, what is the tone of the moment of the episode that you want to convey? And then can you use music to enhance this tone or mood, or sound effects, of course, too. Another thing to think about, and this is something that you can only kind of figure out as you're mixing, is what's the pace of the narration? So I'm going to talk about how you can revise the pace and change it a little bit, but the music needs to kind of match the pace of the speaking. And this is something that's really hard to do without actually literally just putting them together and listening to it. There were times where I thought I found the perfect song and it just was too slow or too fast for the pacing of the narration. And the pacing of the narration sounded really natural, and it was really natural, and I didn't want to mess with that. So I found a different song that was more appropriate to the pace that you're trying to achieve. Another thing to ask yourself is, are music and sound effects adding something to this moment, or are they distracting from an important moment? So again, sometimes less is more. Something to consider is that silence can also be used to emphasize something just as much as music can. So a lot of times, for example, I think in a historical podcast, music can be really good to kind of keep attention through an explanation, say, about the Council of Trent, for example. Something that is inherently interesting to some of us in its own way, but might be a lot of information for somebody else. Of course, you've tailored it for a podcast, but you might need to kind of move it along there through the history. But if you get to the pivotal moment, for me, talking about, say, enclosure of religious women, I might stop the music to emphasize that moment, because that's the driving force behind that part of the podcast. That's the takeaway. And stopping music at that time can signal to the listener that this is really important and this is what we're driving toward. Just as adding music at a key moment can also do the same thing. So you want to achieve a balance, I think, and it's just something to, it's self-editing. I think a lot of people put too much music at their first time around, and you just have to kind of think about revising that. So that's just a little note about, less again is more. Okay, so I'm going to show an example and just kind of show a little bit about doing some of this mixing and how it sort of works. So we'll go right back to Adobe Audition. Okay, so as you can see, let me pull here to the episode. As you can see, again, we have 4 different tracks here, and all of your mixing will be kind of deciding what to do. There's a couple of things I wanted to kind of show that I was doing in this episode in terms of the mixing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of them later, but I wanted to kind of show you here in Adobe Audition so that you can see the way it's working. So one of them is, I don't know why that happened. Okay. One of them is the way that things are kind of working here. So this down here is a piece of music that I got off of the YouTube audio library. As you can see, there's a pause in the host's narration where the music comes in. Down here, this yellow line is the volume. So it's a slight fade. The music starts pretty slowly anyway, and it kind of fades itself in. So I didn't have to do a lot of that, but you want the transition to be pretty smooth. You don't want to abruptly just start music kind of blaring after someone's talking. So as you can see, this stops here, and then the music kind of comes in. And then something that I did here, so I decided I wanted music to happen for a certain amount of time. This is a tricky thing, but a lot of times with music, we seek to, as humans, I think, to have the resolution of a song, right? So I'm not familiar with all of the proper terminology and for why we do this, but we seek a resolution at the end of a song. You don't want to stop and just in the middle of a song abruptly, or even sometimes fading out of a song doesn't sound right. This song, I liked the way the song ended. However, the song went on for like 4 minutes, and I didn't want to use 4 minutes of music. So what I did is, and you can see it here, I cut the song on a beat and spliced it with a beat much later on, like 3 minutes later, that was the same and it worked. And I just stuck it together, and then the song ends earlier. So I want to do this because I really liked how the ending worked, and it was going to match up perfectly with this other pause that I had created in the narration. This is again where the artistic kind of flair comes in. Sometimes you could overlap them slightly and they will fit into each other, and it will nicely work to end the song. But that is one trick that I learned as I was doing this, to kind of get a really satisfying resolution to maybe a 40-second clip of music that you wanted to use that had a really nice start and a really nice finish. So this is also a way you could cut around any kind of lyrics or something like that, although a lot of the YouTube audio library stuff doesn't have lyrics, and that would be, of course, distracting if you're putting narration over the top of it. Again, you can see here the way I'm kind of able to layer things, again, using the fade in and fade out with things like interviews. And here, for example, there's a lot happening. So just so you can kind of see it, there's a sound effect happening here, going into an interview with music underneath it, going into a narrator who's reminding the audience who is speaking in the interview, going back into the interview, and then the interview fades and the music fades out. So that's just the basics of how you can do different types of mixing. You can mix and match and experiment with what sounds good. You can see up here, so the red is the music. You can kind of see the balance of music I've used in this episode. There is music present throughout. It's sort of, I would say maybe slightly more music than there is not music, but you can see that I have extended periods of time where I don't use any music. And again, just thinking about the balance is really important. Okay, so that's just the basics. It's, you know, within something like this, you can move things around and adjust as needed. It all just takes listening and thinking about it, but that's just basically how you mix something. Okay, so. That brings us to step 3, which is revisions. So this is what would happen once you've edited your audio, you've mixed the episode. I call it a rough cut, a rough mix. And then you're thinking about how you can make the episode the best that it can be. I recommend getting a second pair or 2 of ears to listen to it. It can be really difficult when you've been working on an episode for a long time to then hear issues, hear sounds that you may have missed, like a breath or a mic bump, to hear when maybe the music is just like not the best choice. It's good to get other opinions. And so have a friend or 2 listen to it and tell you what they think. Things to pay attention to would be volume. So you want to make sure that everything is, again, similar in volume. You don't want a moment where the music comes in really loud. There was a time where I was using like a old timey rifle shot sound effect for this kind of like war scene. It was like horses galloping and like this kind of evocative of a war or a battle type scene. And I had to really reduce, you don't want it to be scary and you don't want it to be too much for the listener. So I had to adjust the volume on something like that. Transitions. So as I was showing, fading in and fading out, making sure those are not too abrupt is really important. And another person could help tell you about that. Pacing and tone. Again, how is the pacing of the audio, of the narration? A lot of times people speak too quickly. Also, people speak too slowly. It's good to have it sound natural. So having someone else just, back that up is good. Does the tone fit? And then again, the overall balance of elements. So you don't want there to be a ton of music in the front half of the podcast and almost no music at the end. It will noticeably sound unbalanced to the listener. And sometimes when you're so close to it and you've been working on an episode for a few days, it can help to have another person point these things out and listen for them. So I've kind of identified a couple of things to look for, one being volume balance, like I mentioned. So at the bottom of Adobe Audition, that's where it's looking on Adobe Audition, there's the levels bar. So as you play, it will go up and down and show you the levels of someone speaking or of the music. You should aim between -9 and -3 is the goal. You don't want it to max out. And as you can see here, the 2 red bars after the 0 means that this levels bar has been pushed to the max at some point in the period of time that I was listening to it. And you want to check those spots and reduce them. So that could mean someone laughed. That could mean the music was really loud, or there's like a big cymbal crash and it's blowing out the speaker, and you want to make sure that that's not happening. So this is a great indicator. And again, -9 to -3 is the sweet spot for like a podcast episode. That will make sure it's appropriate level. Smooth transitions is the second part. So again, this is where you're just going to make sure that there's no abrupt transitions between sounds or between sounds and silence. So this is a great example. We have an interview, and then there is a spot where we wanted to include a recording of Louis Armstrong singing on this radio show. As you can see, I faded in the sound of the singing because it was very abrupt to just start with someone just like belting it out in the middle of this, right? So I faded it in and faded it out at the end so that it sounded really smooth and transitioned nicely between the narration and the sound effect I was using. It just needs to sound smooth. Oftentimes people do these too quick abruptly. There is like a small fade, but you can't even register it with your ears. So all you have to do is listen. Pacing and tone. So again, this is, does the music complement the narration, both in tone and in pace? There are ways to change this. So I wanted to show an example. This little, on Adobe Audition, you can adjust the pacing using this little stopwatch. As you can see in this section, I've extended the pacing slightly by 3%. I've slowed it down by 3% to make the tone a little bit, the pacing sound a little bit more natural. It was just a slightly fast. It was a lot of information. I felt like it was being dealt a little bit too quickly. It can really make a difference. Even a few percentage points can really make a difference in making something sound natural. You don't want to do too much of this, but I promise it won't make anyone sound like a chipmunk or any of those things. You're not going to be doing drastic tone and pace changes, but even just a few tweaks here and there will really help, especially if someone is varying their pace and tone throughout the episode. It can help to kind of slow some things down or speed them up if someone's speaking really slowly. And then again, overall balance. So you want to make sure that the whole overall episode feels like it progresses in a way that's natural and balanced. And again, this means not distributing music or sound effects unevenly. Of course, you shouldn't be adding things just to add them, but thinking about where they should appear. Again, this is why having a transcript or a script will help, because you can just make sure that things are, happening throughout the episode. You're not using, for example, a sound effect only one time in the whole episode. That might be kind of strange. You're committing to these elements that you're employing, and you're doing them throughout in a way that feels consistent, so that it feels like a single person developed the episode and it's got kind of a single kind of a flow, right? So you want it to seem like it goes together. It's not different from 1 minute to the next. This brings us to kind of the final step, which is promotion. Promotion can be very tricky. I've just got some tips for you, but I am by no means a master of making a podcast like, wildly successful to millions of listeners. But I think there are some things that we can do to help promote historical podcasts and think about as you're creating a podcast. So once you've revised, you've edited the sound, you've mixed the sound, you've revised the episode, you think it sounds great, and you're ready to put it out there. How do you do that? So there's a couple things that need to happen before your podcast can just hit, Apple Podcasts or Spotify. First, you need to find a host for the episode. I'm going to talk a little bit about that and what that is. You need to make the episode accessible to everybody. And I'm going to talk about how to do that. I recommend creating a press kit. This is something used in marketing to help distribute information about the episode and make it easy for others to share your episode. And then you also need to contact parties who might be interested in your episode to let them know about it and help them, ask them to distribute it for you. I think, the overall thing that you're trying to do here is you're not necessarily trying to create an audience for your episode out of scratch. You're trying to tap into existing audiences that would be interested in what you have to say. So there are other entities that already have an audience on, wherever, their social media or on, people that they know on their email lists. You're trying to get to those so that they can help distribute it for you. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. What you need to do is connect and network with the right entities so that your podcast can tap into existing audiences. First things first, you need to have a host. So basically, hosts are different. And here's a cluster of examples. Hosts are like the entities that will be hosting your podcast MP3, basically. So Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, they do not store all the podcast episodes that are distributed on their websites, like on their servers. They don't have room for that. They're not interested in doing that. They're pulling from a host to put them on to their platforms. So you need to have a host that will host your content. So there are a couple of these with free hosting options. I found Spreaker and Podbean. I haven't used these, and I didn't do this for Reverb Effect. This is probably something the Medieval Academy will be doing for the Medieval Academy podcast. But ideally, you need to find a place that will host it, and then you can pull from there to send it to the entities that you want, like Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. So again, they're not like actually hosting it themselves. They pull from a host to do that. It's a little confusing, but it all makes sense. It's all about servers and the ability to pull, they're hosting so many things, they don't have room to host all the podcasts. So that's how it works. So these free ones will host a certain amount of hours, usually for free, or for a certain amount of time. There's also like some that have pretty low hosting fees that will host your MP3 basically of your finished product. Accessibility is really important. So this means getting a transcript for your episode. So if you didn't do that before when you were mixing it, because your style of mixing, you didn't want to plan it out that way. At this point, you do need to have a transcript. This makes sure that everyone can easily access your podcast. It can work with e-reader devices so that everyone can have your podcast and be able to access it, whether by listening to it or otherwise, by reading it or other ways of doing this, right? You can also include, and I highly recommend including footnote citations or even like a reading list with your transcript. For my episode, I also included a transcript of my full interview with Nancy E. Van Dusen, so that people could see where I was pulling out clips from that I use, and then they can read or read the whole interview. That's something you can consider, of course, with the permission of the person you were interviewing. Again, this is a website I recommend to create a transcript. Again, I didn't ever run out of free minutes of transcription. Of course, transcribing by hand, I don't recommend because it takes forever. For those of you who do oral histories, you might know this, but there are programs that can help. Of course, you should look through it because it's not perfect, but this website does a really good job in my experience. Also, you want to make sure you create image descriptions for any images you're using. So they can be alt text. So again, so that those are accessible. And similarly to music, you want to make sure your images that you're choosing to represent your episode, because all podcast hosting services have an image included. So if you listen to podcasts, you're familiar with that. There's always kind of an image. All the images also have to be free use. Luckily for pre-modernists, most images, if you're using an image that was produced at the time, those are free use because of the age of the image is typically, there are a couple of museums that don't allow that, but typically they're free use. You have to just look at it. You can, Google Creative Commons licensing and see, but there's a lot of images you can find that are free use that would apply. So just making sure you have image descriptions again to keep everything accessible and make sure that everyone has a chance to experience your podcast. Okay, this is related to creating a press kit. So press kits or they can also be called media kits, and there's some really subtle differences between them, but for our purposes, they're kind of the same. So they're helping people share your podcast more easily. So I think that the key elements of a press or media kit includes text that demonstrates the purpose and content of your podcast, which includes a concise and intriguing summary of the episode. I'm talking like a few sentences. You really want it to be something that grabs someone and makes it relevant as quickly as possible. So that takes some work, and it's a skill. But yeah, I think of it as something like a bite-sized version of work. And you want to also include your pictures, your images, and I think even sample social media text, because you want to make it as easy as possible for someone to share your episode. Of course, someone could craft, a museum. You might send it to a museum. They could craft their own social media post about your episode. But wouldn't it be nice if they could just copy and paste something that you've already created for them that fits in Twitter and that they can just use? It makes it so much easier for that social media person to put it out there, and it removes a barrier for them to do that. So you want to make it as easy as possible. I'm going to be showing an example. Here's some effective press kit. So again, short descriptive sentences. You want your image to be powerful and evocative. It should be eye-catching, right? I don't know about you, but when I'm looking at different podcasts, I mean, the image does kind of draw me in. It's something that you see that is like, oh, that's kind of, what's that? Oh, now I read the description. That sounds really interesting. I recommend both a square image and a 16:9 ratio image because those are the most popular images for use on social media and use in different podcasting services. So you want to have those ready to go. Think about, I always include hashtags in my press kits because, again, if you're using especially Twitter, which I'll talk about, you want to use the appropriate hashtags. Not everyone will know what hashtags apply to your topic. You should do some research beforehand. For example, my episode, there's a hashtag on Twitter, hashtag Nuntastic. I work on nuns. The Nuntastic hashtag got me a lot of followers and retweets because I was able to tag it appropriately, and lovers of history of nuns were all about it, and they were really sharing it in their circles. So I knew about that hashtag, but I don't think another person might. So you want to include that. And then contact information is really crucial so that someone could contact you for more information. I had a couple of people interested in doing spotlights on reverb effect related to, in our College of LSA, for example. They were able to contact me really easily because I included my email, and they just clicked on it and they were able to get in touch with me and make those a reality. I'm including, so this is a lot of text. I don't expect you to read it all. I wanted you to see an example of the press kit for my episode. And I just wanted you to see how I break it down. So first things first, it's, I talk about which season it is, which episode it is, title, and who did the episode, which is me. We have a teaser and a blurb that's on the website for Reverb Effect. It's 2 sentences, including a question. Questions are a good way to kind of entice people to listen, to kind of introduce your idea. We had, again, from our website, a short episode description. This is, I would think, even maybe possibly too long for a press kit. I would recommend 1 paragraph, or you can have 1 paragraph of the episode description and 1 paragraph describing the podcast itself. I had already contacted all of our contacts at this point and explained what Reverb Effect was. But if you were sending this more broadly, or when I sent it to different entities, I had to explain that again. So having that in the press kit would be great. If I could redo it again, that's what I would do. And then this was the second part of it, the sample social media post. This is a social media post that fits the length requirements of Twitter. I know that because I literally typed it into Twitter to draft it, and that's what fit, including a hashtag to Reverb Effect. I could have, if I would do this again, I would have tagged myself instead of just saying Hayley Bowman. I would have put my little handle there, right? Including the link. Someone could easily, and this happened, just different entities literally copied and pasted that and threw it up on Twitter, and there it was. Hashtags to include are right there. Those are some that you could use, especially public history. Twitter historians is a good one. Medieval Twitter, early modern, these things, academic chatter, academic Twitter. I highly recommend Twitter because academics are all over that. So that's a great way to get it out there. And then again, contact information. I included the Reverb Effect logo, and then I did all of this via Google Docs. So in the same folder that I was sharing, I also had the images at different aspect ratios and that kind of a thing included within that folder so that someone ready to do this was able to just pull it and post it on their social medias and post it in their emails very easily. The last stage is promoting the episode. Who do you send the episode to besides all your friends and family who are excited to hear you talk about whatever you're talking about in your episode? These are just 4 examples. There's many other places, but I think museums and archives do want to hear from you. Did you do research somewhere and now you're using that to create a podcast episode? That's really cool. A lot of museums and archives were tweeting about episodes that were featuring documents that were in their collections. They're excited about this. University departments, related resources. So your university, related universities you may have done research at, contact departments and let them know about it. They will probably post it. They'll either send it to their listservs or they'll post it on social media. They'll send it out. Especially think about like the grad school here at Michigan, the College of LSA, these kinds of entities want to promote what their grad students are doing. So if you're a grad student at the university, tell people about it. Funding bodies, did you get funding to do your research? For example, the American Catholic Historical Association very generously gave me a summer grant during that time. I did my research and I used that research as part of my podcast episode. So I sent it to them and they tweeted about it. I let them know, hey, your money enabled me to do this. And they were very excited to like share that with the world, right? Again, they want to share what you're doing and they're supporting your work. So let them know. And then Twitter, if you're not on Twitter, I highly recommend you at least make, a professional Twitter account. I'm by no means a Twitter expert, but I will say it's a great way to promote something like a podcast. It's a great way to connect with other people. And honestly, there's just so much there. And there's a lot of, I guess negatives to Twitter, but there's also so many ways that you can use it to network, and you can use it to really connect with people who want to listen to a podcast like this, a historical podcast. So that's all I have for you today, but that's just my general basic, crash course guide to editing a podcast and promoting a podcast. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, but yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hayley. I just want to jump in and I think on behalf of everybody who's been here, thank you. Give a little applause here. That was really fantastic. I certainly feel more prepared to go forward and make a podcast. Whether I will do that or not remains to be seen, but I feel very prepared. It does look like we've got a couple of questions here preloaded, so let's just start from the top and kind of work our way down. For those of you who are here, just a reminder to use the Q&A feature for anything that's bubbled up throughout the presentation. And also, you can feel free to use the chat as well, if that's going to be easier for you to access. One final time, I'm going to throw these links up as well, just so you have access to them. But let's get to the questions. So we have a question from Diana, who wants to know, her question is about the editing process originally, so the sound and music editing, and how much the soundtrack itself is magnified when you edit it.
Can you clarify, do you mean when I'm on the screen and I was kind of zooming in to edit out the sound, or do you mean like magnified as in like a volume magnification? If I could ask for some clarification.
And Diana, if you're here, feel free to clarify in the chat. My understanding, yes, zoomed in. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure a particular percentage. I'm not sure if it tells me, but it is zoomed in quite a bit. So if you think about it, some of those pauses I was showing you were maybe a couple of seconds, if that. Like that, right? A little bit of a pause. So generally, I to see that dust, I was saying the sound dust, you do have to kind of, depending on the quality, sometimes it's a lot more visible if it's kind of loud. Sometimes people have, for example, an AC running in the background that makes like a noticeable amount. But it is noticeable when you listen, you can hear a buzzing in the background or a little hum, and it sounds much more clear when you do remove it. And you can play around with it. It all depends on the quality of your recording. But that, for example, I have a pretty good recording environment. I record in a closet. I have my setup ready. It's got soft surroundings. So there isn't a ton of background noise in that example I showed. So I was zoomed in quite a bit to see it.
Awesome. And I am just a reminder to people, I'm kind of hastily trying to type up answers so that they will be available written as well. So Diana, I'll get that answer to you as well. We do have a second question also from Diana though, which is about how much time you would recommend spending on post-production for just as an example, an hour-long episode.
Yeah, that's a great question. So to give you a breakdown, once I had done it, I would say by the time I was on maybe like the third episode, so I had practice with 2 episodes of Reverb Effect, which ended up being around 30 minutes a piece. So that would be half the time. I would say I spent, I could do it in 2 days, but if I wasn't doing other things, and I would spend maybe 5 hours a day. So the first day was all that editing, all removing the background noise, fine tuning it, cutting it. And the second day was all mixing. So that's where I'm adding in all the fun, sound effects and fine tuning it, tweaking it, making it all sound the way I wanted it to. So that's a total of 10 hours, I would estimate. that it took me once I was more familiar with how to do it. So it did take me, I would say, at least two. I think I got better and better every time, right? I mean, you always get better. I had more, ideas of what I wanted to do, and I knew how to do everything. But it is a time-consuming process. I don't know that it would double the amount of time with a longer episode, but it would, the sound editing portion would take longer. But again, I was also doing scripted episodes, and I wanted to really remove like a lot of the breathing. I wanted to really make it a high level of production that I don't think, so for example, my husband listens to lots of sports podcasts that come out like every day, and they are recapping like the games from the day before. And those podcasts don't do that extent of editing. You can still hear people breathing and stuff. It's fine. It's natural. It sounds good. It's a different type of expectation for that kind of podcast. And I think it's okay. You just have to be realistic about what your expectations are. And that would take less time. I would be denoising, but I wouldn't necessarily be going in and like removing all the breathing and removing, all of those little things. You can fine tune it a little bit, but not as much. So that's just how long it took me. Everyone's different. So yeah, that's just an estimate of time.
All right, and again, got that one in there. So we have another question from an anonymous attendee who says, thank you so much for this. Now, since you're someone who's self-taught in the podcasting world, about how long did it take you to get comfortable with doing sound editing? And the context for this is that our questioner has no experience with this kind of software and is a little worried it's not going to be worth the learning curve.
That's a great question. This is something I was really concerned about when I started doing this. I guess concerned is I was nervous. It's like, am I ever going to learn this? And wow, am I going to just sink so much time into learning that it's not going to be worth it to me, or it's going to take up a lot of my time? And honestly, I found it to be a lot easier than I expected. I watched a few YouTube videos, and basically it was just things that I encountered. So I reserved some time to do this, a few days. I didn't spend all day working on it, but I would pop in and say, okay, how do I remove like the background noise? And I just Googled it. And then I, found out how to do these noise process things and how to do all of that. And it doesn't, once you're kind of familiar with something like that, whatever program you're using, I have found, like, for example, with Adobe Audition, everything was kind of similar in a way, right? So once you learn how to noise reduction with the process method, where you're selecting the kind of thing you want to remove, that's how you do the de-essing, for example. You select an S sound and it removes it throughout. There's a lot of things that don't require much besides hitting the button and seeing, what it sounds like. And then deciding, do I want to kind of change it a little bit and listen to it again, undo that and try it again in a different way. So I would say, my first episode was a huge learning experience, but by the second one I was working on, I felt way more comfortable. I had a plan, which I outlined the plan basically in my presentation. I had a plan. I knew what I wanted to do. And yeah, it really only took working through one to determine what I wanted to do. And of course I got better at it, and I got it became so much more like a fast process, because I was like, oh, first thing I need to do is get rid of this, boom, boom, boom. And I can do that really quickly. But I became pretty comfortable cutting, even working through the first episode. I was after a few hours of cutting things and moving things around, it became very intuitive. And I felt like I could I felt very comfortable having gone from nothing to that. I will say also, Adobe Audition has a tutorial. It's built in. When you open up Adobe Audition and you hit, there's a podcasting template. And when you hit that, it will tell you how to edit and do a podcast. And it's got a great little tutorial. And that didn't take very long. That took maybe 20 minutes to watch. And I felt, even just doing that, I felt even more confident in my abilities to do it.
Thank you so much. Okay, gone ahead and answered that one. So check out the typed up notes if you want more. All right, and we do have another question from Peter. So Peter asks if you'd be able to talk about working with audio from recording someone remotely, either via Zoom or a phone call, and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, excuse me. So with a Zoom recording or a phone call or Zencaster, I recommend Zencaster for a remote recording, which I talked about last time and I think is linked. That's a great option because it gives you a higher quality recording than even Zoom or on the phone does. I think you have to just be realistic in your expectations. So the quality of the recording is not going to be that of a recording on a professional mic in your closet environment, right? And that's okay. The editing is very similar. I just think you need to take kind of even a lighter touch with it. So you're not going to be able to remove all of the sound in the background and keep it sounding natural, because if you do that, it will be very abrupt when there's a pause. It will sound like it just it sounds like the recording cut off almost to your ear. It's like, where did it go? And then it comes back because you reduced it way too much, because there will just be extra background noise in a recording like that. It's just the nature of the recording. So taking a lighter touch and saying, hey, it's okay. I try to keep it natural. So people have tics when they're speaking. People say, people repeat themselves. Those things, as long as it's not too distracting, I think you should keep them in, because it sounds better. It sounds more natural because it's a recording of someone talking and you want it to keep that tone. I think, it depends on what you're going for, but it's obvious that it will be a recording and that it will be a interview or something like that. Then you want it to sound like an interview and you don't want it to sound overly done and overly polished, because that takes away from that. So yeah, it's basically the same process, but I would say less. And, if someone's got a big breath or a big sigh, you could remove it, and it's fairly easy to do without making it sound really obvious. But I would say you should do minimal, a really, really light touch on something like that.
All right, that's a good answer. I like thinking about kind of opting for that natural vibe as a strategic choice, saying, given my limits of my recording software or what I have available, I might choose to produce something that sounds maybe like you had mentioned, like a sports podcast or something that feels a little more natural. That's excellent. Well, if anyone has any more questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Hayley, I was curious about, with your experiences looking for music, audio, all of these things. So you gave us a lot of really useful websites. And I was wondering what you've run into in your experiences with Creative Commons, how much of the software you find the audio files that you find are available through Creative Commons or are free to license, and are there also, and so I'm thinking about my own personal experience, sometimes when I do Google image searches to find images for classroom use or for lessons, I do the same thing, and then I notice there's a category where it's like free maybe. Do you have an experience navigating those categories?
Yeah, so you have to be really images, especially, I feel like get misrepresented a lot online for some reason. You just have to be careful and really search into where's the original image. A lot of times I found with images, you think that it's for use because someone stole it from someone else and then posted it as free use somewhere. So do your best. You know how to do research and investigate things. So I think, take that time, because you really don't want to be infringing on someone's creative property, right? And none of us want to do that. I do really like I mentioned, YouTube Audio Library, I have found to be very reliable in terms of music, because there is a filter. You can specifically select things that are free use and that don't need credit. Now you can also, I like to give credit anyway, and you can also find people who say, hey, you can use this as long as you credit me, and then you can add a credit in the transcript, you credit, put the credit in the description of the episode and those kinds of things. And you can do that. But I think if you use things like archive.org and YouTube Audio Library, I think those are very straightforward in terms of the music, making sure that you're crediting people appropriately. Just make sure you're filtering correctly. I have found with YouTube Audio Library, I was able to find so much music. There's so much music on there that's available for free use, that I never ran into a problem where I thought, oh, wow, I really can't find anything. I mean, I'm talking like hundreds and hundreds of songs. I often had, I like to spend, it was always kind of fun to do that and to, spend some time like listening and starring things and saving them and then deciding what I want to use. Like my episode, I'm like, I need something, I wanted a musical cue for an angelic vision because I had a lot of visions happening that I was recreating, and I wanted there to be something. And I was able to find something that really like evoked the tone I wanted. And I was able to do that pretty easily. You just, I typed in keywords and searched for it and just listened to things. And there was plenty to choose from. In making, I produced now 7 episodes where I chose songs. I didn't have any trouble finding things. Sometimes it took a little looking. There were several times I picked songs and then I had people listen and they said, oh, I don't know about that song. And I would just change it. And that's also fine. Also, you can have creative disagreements on what you think works or not. But, I try to, try things and just see what I think. And I think that's the best way to do it, for me at least.
Definitely. Thank you. We've got another question from Peter, who asks if you'd be able to talk about microphones and special equipment that you use for mounting them, or just kind of talking around microphones in general, I think, what your experiences have been.
Absolutely. And I think in that resources, I think there was some links, at least from last time, about some microphones. So for your general at-home recording needs, I think a USB microphone, professional microphone, will work. The brands that were recommended to me that I've used and I found to be very, very good are Rode, RODE, and Yeti mics. There's different USB ones available. And I found that those are great because they include, especially the models that include a built-in pop filter. So if you've seen images, and I think I had one in my presentation today of the kind of the pop filter in front of the mic, that circle thing that's kind of connected. You can always buy those too. Those are good if you already have a microphone that doesn't have one. You can add that. It usually clips onto the mic and it sits in front of the mic, and it reduces those plosives and the hiss, the S sounds as you record. But a lot of the USB mics include a pop filter built in. And I was able to achieve very high quality recordings with just a USB microphone without the additional pop filter. It had the built-in one. And I think that was in the $50-ish range. I bought it online. There's some links I think that Logan has there for some brand recommendations. And as you record, a lot of these have different settings. You can read about them online. You can experiment with different settings. Everyone's voice is different. So it's really hard to make a general recommendation for each person and your setting. But definitely give yourself time to experiment with the mic setup. But I think what's key in your setup is the soft surroundings. So as I mentioned, and I think a lot of people since COVID have been doing this who are recording at home, I record in a closet. And I don't live in a place that has walk-in closets. A walk-in closet would be perfect because you would have a little more space, but it would be small room with soft surroundings of clothes. I record in a regular closet, and I make a stack of books, and then I put my microphone, I make sure I kind of make sure it's about this distance away from my mouth. I found that works for me. It's angled toward me, and I do a little test recording, see how it sounds, make sure it's okay, and record with the door closed in the closet. It's not the most glamorous. It's not the most comfortable, but I'm able to do, a 30-minute episode that way. If you had a more elaborate setup, there's great. There's like boom mics are good too. That kind of they're probably more ergonomic, right? You're able to set up a little differently and that kind of a thing, and set them up. But the main thing is that you get kind of the sound quality that you want. And I think the only way to do that is to experiment with your equipment. But I would say, I don't think you need to break the bank. As a grad student, I'm on a budget. I can't invest in like a really, really expensive mic at this time. And I think you can really do something with something that's like mid-range, not to say it's not still expensive in its own way, but like you don't need to be investing hundreds of dollars in your setup, in my opinion. I think you can get, the quality that's acceptable and that's good and people will listen. It doesn't jar and doesn't hurt the ears to listen to with something that's a bit of a more affordable setup. There's also mics for rent. So here at Michigan, you can rent them from the College of LSA. a lot of universities allow you to rent microphones. A lot of public libraries allow you to rent microphones. So thinking about those brands, Rode and Yeti are ones that I like. There's other ones who you can always try them. And I think the best thing is to try them and listen and then see what they sound like and see what you think. I found my Rode had a warm sound with my voice that I liked. It sounded warm. The other mic gave me more of a metallic sound for whatever reason. It might've been my setup, but everyone's voice is different. I found the one that I liked the way it sounded for me. It sounded nice. So I went with that. So just give yourself time to experiment if you can and look into rental options. I think is a great way to do it.
That's a great question and a really good answer. Now, in the answer to that question, I've also linked to a website with like podcasting microphones that are recommended, and it has a lot of the ones that Hayley's mentioned specifically with links. It is an unaffiliated website, but just a lot of that pops up there. So if anybody has any more questions, feel free to, again, as we were mentioning, drop them in. And Hayley, I was wondering as well, while you were talking, there was specifically something that I was thinking about with editing. I think the difference between editing and mixing, well, I'll just ask an open-ended question, which is, could you talk a little bit more specifically, and you mentioned in an earlier response about how when you were kind of doing this, it was a 2-day process. You did most of the editing on one day, and then it was kind of the mixing and the more fun stuff on the other day. Would you just talk a little bit more in depth about the activities specifically that fell, and whether or not you found that it was strategic to try to tackle certain things on day one and then give yourself a break for day two? Like, how did you handle that plan-wise?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, my distinctions between editing and mixing, that was just kind of my terminology. But the way I conceive of it for me is editing is basically getting the recordings, whether it's an interview or your own narration, whatever, all of that stuff that you recorded yourself, is getting that in really good shape to be then mixed in and used wherever you need it throughout the episode. So I think it's essential to do that first, because that way everything is the appropriate length and sounds good and is ready to go before you start adding in other tracks and like making it way more complicated with mixing, which I'm calling the second part, which is, adding in all that stuff and arranging it basically, right? Creating the episode itself. And I think in order to do that, you need to have all your elements there. The biggest one being the narration that you've recorded or the interview that you've recorded, for example. So the editing would be, getting all of that ready, removing the background audio, cutting out the moments that are, not usable for whatever reason, or you've decided, hey, I don't like this 30-second tangent I went on about something. That's where you can take that out. It can be gone. You never have to think about it again. You don't have to account for it while you're mixing. You can just remove that. You decided you didn't want it, that kind of a thing. There is more cutting that can happen as you mix. That's pretty normal, or especially when you're trying to figure out how to, if you've got a narrative and then you want to add in elements from interview and you want to mix and match, and you can always cut things and move things around while you're mixing. But I consider that to be, again, more of the mixing, where you're putting it all together and making the episode. And ideally, when you're doing that, you've got really clean audio from your narrations and your recordings that you've already kind of fixed. And I do find if you start mixing first on Adobe Audition, at least, it can be really, really hard to then go in and edit later, because you've pulled stuff from different areas, and it can be hard to figure out, because you have the option to, let's say you take a sentence that you say at one point and you move it to a different place. When you're editing the recording in Adobe Audition, it's back where it was before. The original track stays the same for when you edit the sound, if that makes sense. I know it's kind of confusing. So you want to do all of that first before you start moving everything around, because it can be very confusing as the editor, as the person doing it, to figure out where everything goes and how it all fits together if you're doing it the opposite way. Does that make sense? I know it's a lot. So I just say, yeah, just get it all how you want it first. Get all your, gather your elements and then put them all together. It's like you're making a collage. You want to cut out the images that you want to add to the collage before you arrange them, right? You want everything to be good before you're like throwing it all together, if that makes sense.
That's a great analogy. I do think it's really helpful. So thank you. And we've got 2 questions here. So we have one from Diana and then one from John. Now, Diana's asking whether there's a database for podcasts where one can search to see podcasts that are similar, or to make sure that one, isn't duplicating another podcast. And what you recommend about that.
That's a great question. I'm not certain if there's a database of all podcasts, but what I would recommend doing is going on to, so there's just a few major podcasts, podcast entities that they're not hosts, but they're not hosting the podcast, but they're like distributing the podcast. So that's like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify, I think are the big 4 that most podcasts would be on. And then I would go there, and you can usually search by genre. So if you're doing a historical podcast, I would look at podcasts that are available there. There are also some websites. I could go get links for them after this, and I can send them to Logan to add to that document of websites that have brought together different historical based podcasts and like put them all kind of together on lists. And there's some that are like collaborative, or they're doing co-sponsorships with each other. They're part of collaborations, or they're part of like groups that are working together and they mention each other in their podcast. I have some links for those that I could get so you can see examples. But I think the best way to do that is to like be a podcast listener. We can go on to these places and just search and to make sure. I wouldn't think, if you're creating something yourself, of course we don't want to be plagiarizing somebody. I think, if you're telling a historical story that you're coming up with yourself, you wouldn't be doing that. But that can give you an idea of what's out there and different formats that people use. And so that you can make sure, you're differentiating yourself enough. It would be a good idea, especially when you think about like a name for your podcast. Make sure no one's using the name that you want, obviously. So that's one way to do it. Of course, you can Google the name as well, but that's what you should be doing to make sure you're not like accidentally stealing something someone else is using in that way, for example. I would you should make your own logo, I guess, for your podcast, but you just want to make sure. That's another thing to think about too, is if you are starting your own podcast and you are coming up with like your logo. I showed the Reverb Effect logo, for example. It might be helpful to look up other historical podcasts and see what could make your logo stand out. So you might notice, say a lot of them use red as their color in the image for their logo. Maybe you should use a different color, because then it will be like a pop in that space. For example, I don't know if that's actually true, that red is, something that's used a lot. Our light blue logo, I think, does stand out if you're looking at different podcasts. That's just something to think about as you think about like marketing and how to make your podcast kind of pop. Thinking about the colors you're using, thinking about the tone you're setting, the mood you're evoking with that is one way to do it. And again, it would just be, I would say, search on those big 4. If you're just going to look at one, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, I think, are kind of the biggest ones. A lot of them have the same podcasts hosted on them. That's usually, if you have one, you put them on those 4. So that would be my recommendation. And like I said, I can get some lists and links for Logan to add.
Perfect. And then in the answer to that, I've typed up the directories that you mentioned. And I also just found there's an online list of a couple of different directories. So that should all be available for you, Diana, right there. And then John, you have a question as well, right? Oh, am I the only one? Nope, we can't hear you, John. Nope. That's all right. What's weird was it was working at the beginning. We heard from you at the beginning, so your audio does work on some level.
Now?
Yes.
Okay. Just click something enough and it will work eventually. Okay. So my question then real quick is for the benefit of everybody that maybe wasn't here last time, and now that we know like what you mean by charting out a path forward, like having an intention with like the sound mixing already and thinking about that from the beginning. like, let's say for a half an hour podcast, 30-minute to like an hour episode, like how long is a script usually then when you're scripting it out? Like, because your rule of thumb seems to be less is more. So definitely like affording for that sound effects and everything, like in terms of page count or word count, like what's a ballpark figure if we're thinking of like 30, 40 minutes or that kind of length?
That's a great question. And that's an astute observation, because I would say in my experience, almost every time I did an episode, we began, well, I wouldn't let us begin the recording process until we were within a certain range, a word count range, because it's so easy for podcasts to get really long. And we had a target. So I personally had a target of around 30 minutes, which I was able to hit because of a pretty strict word count kind of limit that I was putting on my episode producers who were writing the episodes. And that was under 4,000 words, which isn't that long really, especially for academics who are used to writing a lot. And that included elements like, so for example, especially people working like on modern US projects, sometimes we're able to use recordings from the archive. That included things like that. It included words if you're pulling from a primary source and you're having someone voice act it, that's included in the word count. I found that under 4,000 words gave us enough space to have an introduction, which was not included. So this is a little bit, I would say about 5 minutes. So that would be maybe under 4,000 would be about 25 minutes of music and content, interview stuff. And there was about 5 minutes of basically an introduction, the music at the beginning, right? Almost every podcast has a little like introduction, like ours says, you know, this is reverb effect. And it's got this like song that we always use. And there's like an outro where I would talk about who was voice acting in the episode. I would thank the producers. I would give our credits, and there's a little outro music, right? There's about 5 minutes of that content. So about 25 minutes of content was a little under 4,000 words. And if you even fewer words was better, because that gave us more wiggle room for adding in dramatic pauses, adding in a music transition. We had one episode, it just actually came out. It's our first episode of season 3. It's about a radio show called Music Time in Africa. And so the episode producer wanted to feature a lot of clips from the radio show. And we actually had permissions from the archive to do that. So I encouraged them to have even fewer words so that we had a lot of time to actually devote, hey, I want 10 seconds of this radio show. 10 seconds is actually quite a long time when in the grand scheme of things. It sounds like it's nothing, but you add in a few of those, that's 30 seconds of content. That's, you know, however many, it does cut into your time. So you also want someone to be able to speak at a pace that's natural, and that is probably a little bit slower than your typical speaking pace. I would be talking maybe too quickly right now for a podcast episode, especially when you're dealing with like conveying a ton of information. You want it to be delivered in a way that people can follow it and process it as you go. Because typically when you listen to a podcast, no one wants to pause and rewind and re-listen to something because they didn't quite follow the thread of what was happening, right? So think of it as slower than a conference paper. Think of it as slower, an interview will happen in a natural pace, and that's okay. But as you're, if you're scripting it out, it's slower than you think, is the way it sounds best, and it's best received by an audience. So that's kind of my general guideline for about a 30-minute episode. And yeah, I would guess double that for for an hour. But again, that includes everything. And if you want to have a lot of really creative elements, I would give myself more time. You can always cut that later, but I really, really recommend, because the editing process takes a lot of time, I don't want people to be wasting their time editing things that ultimately get cut. So as close to that as you can get, I think the better. The closer you can get to your final kind of timeline that you want, the better, because yeah, you don't want to spend a bunch of time editing something and then you're like, actually, I don't want to use like 5 whole minutes of this that I spent time editing. That sometimes happens. You cut things, that's fine in the revision process, but like get it as close as you can is my advice, because our time is precious. And yeah, it does take time to edit.
That's such a great answer. And I've just thrown that in the chat, or as much as I was able to capture of that. We've got a couple more comments here. One from Peter, and Peter, thank you so much for this. I will add this, your text here to the answer as well, so that we've got that to Diana's earlier answer about how much the soundtrack might be magnified. But just for everyone's edification, you can zoom in or out at will, depending on how much you want to see. You can zoom in on a very small part of the audio or zoom out in order to see it in basically at the level of granular detail that you need. And again, I'll put that under that answer so that we have access to it. Again, reminder, feel free, keep adding questions if you've got them. We have a really lovely appreciation note from Mildred here, who just wants to thank us and mention that the pair of sessions have been very helpful and encouraging. And I'm reading this out loud as a reminder to those of you who are in attendance to hopefully view the other session if you haven't already. You can find it on our website. So that's just my plug to check out workshop number 1 as well, which is in that list of links. So this, it looks like nothing else is rolling in. This feels like a pretty natural place to kind of put a pin in it until we all gather next, whenever that's going to be, for whatever reason. So thank you all again so much for joining us here at the end of the year. I know it's busy, so we really appreciate you finding a moment in your schedules to come and learn a little bit about podcasting. Thank you so much to the MAA for sponsoring this and making it possible. Thank you for John for all the work that you do as the chair. And thank you especially to Hayley. Thank you so much for running these podcasts, putting them together, and sharing your expertise with us. The workshops have been really great, and we're really grateful for it. So that is going to conclude us here. So just a reminder to all of you, check out those links. That's all I have to say. And if you're interested in joining the GSC, self-nomination forms are due. So I think it's time to check it out. Thank you again. Take care. Happy holidays. And we'll see you around.